The Clicker V2 Pro is an accessory by Perun Airsoft for V2 gearboxes, which introduces an audible and real trigger resistance to your trigger pull. Perun sent me over two of their Clicker trigger mods, including the Perun Speeder V2 and the Perun Clicker V2 Pro, which is what I'll be installing today. The Clicker is an innovative trigger mod by Perun Airsoft that enhances the trigger feel and trigger resistance up to 6 pounds, provides an audible clicking every time you fire. The Speeder and Clicker V2 Pro mainly differ in trigger strength adjustment and depth of the audible click noise. Choose the Clicker Pro if you want more realism and the strongest trigger pull option. In the box, you get the Perun V2 Clicker Pro, and you get this fancy 3D printed box that contains various trigger stop parts and options. When you have Perun's HPA trigger board or any of the other AEG trigger boards, trigger stop is optional to install, and it just enhances the realism by fixing the trigger on safe. Each trigger stop arm is a different diameter, so you can find the one that best suits the hole in your gearbox. I'll be dropping this into my HPA VFC HK416 that I just put the compatible Perun HPA trigger board into. If you care to see the details of the trigger board install, then check out my separate video. To start the installation of the Clicker V2 Pro, ideally you remove out your engine and trigger board so that you have the cleanest test fit area and a gearbox shell only. You also have to remove the trigger magnet that came with a Perun HPA trigger board from your trigger, since the Clicker V2 Pro is meant to fit and function without that magnet, and it has its own magnet in the Clicker V2 housing that will activate the trigger and interact with the Perun HPA trigger board. Just note that you may need to retune your trigger sensitivity afterwards depending on how you set up your build. Thankfully for this build, I didn't need to recalibrate my trigger sensitivity, which was reading and picking up fine on a setting of 6. This is the setting I had before I installed the V2 Clicker Pro. Just note the default setting for trigger sensitivity is a 4, and it might work better if you don't have a tunable trigger in place. The Clicker V2 Pro is compression fit into the gearbox shell and shouldn't need any glue or screws to stay in place. Next, we want to size up the trigger stop using one of the various options provided by Perun. I found that the number 3 arm fit best in this gearbox shell, as it gives a snug but not too tight of a fit. There's also a little cap for the trigger stop that's shaped with a D cutout, and it gets pressed onto the trigger stop next. Next, put the trigger stop reset spring into its place. Press the cap onto the trigger stop and secure it with the adjustment screw. You should tighten this screw in most of the way, but leave about a 1mm gap to start as a rough tuning. We'll fine tune the position of the screw later on. It's actually the tip or end of this screw that interacts with the trigger plate to prevent the trigger from being pulled in safe mode. When you close the gearbox shell, you may find that the trigger stop return spring gets caught up in the gearbox, so you might need a thin flat-headed screwdriver to push it in as you close the shell. Now with the Clicker V2 Pro in place and the trigger stop ready, we can close the gearbox up and tune the trigger stop. Through this step, you'll see why it's advised to take out the engine, trigger board, and selector plate. Use the open window on the back to view the inside and see how the trigger stop screw is interacting with the plate of the Clicker V2 Pro. You want to thread the screw in only deep enough to engage with the plate when the trigger stop's moved to the safe position. It takes a bit of trial and error to get the depth set just right. This process may also be done after you've tuned your trigger, because if you adjust the trigger plate position, which I'll show in the next step, you may have to come back to the trigger stop and retune it. Now we can go on to tuning the pre-travel and over-travel, trigger return, and trigger stiffness. Before you go adjusting too much, it's worth taking note and get a feel for how the trigger pull looks and feels in the stock or factory setting. The first screw, and the most important one everyone's wondering about, is the one that adjusts the stiffness and trigger pull weight. What this screw does is it separates this plate from the magnet and changes the resistance of your trigger pull. As the plate moves further from the magnet, the trigger stiffness and trigger pull weight will decrease. If you want the maximum trigger pull weight, then just leave the screw back all the way down, which is what I'm going to try out first. The next set of screws can tune pre-travel and over-travel, but first be mindful of the trigger type that you've got installed. I already have a customizable speed trigger. There's already pre-travel and over-travel adjustment screws on them that I've tuned. So I'll just be leaving the Clicker V2 Pro tuning settings how they were from the factory, and then I can leave that trigger tuning up to my Speed Airsoft tunable trigger screws. You can use either or, but don't overdo it, otherwise you may find your trigger won't move at all or it gets binded against the Clicker V2 Pro. You can also adjust the trigger hardness. Not exactly sure what this does, because it sounds pretty close to the same and feels the same to me with or without the extra magnets in. But as I understand it, in a plastic receiver you may find benefit from this. Most quality replicas are made with metal receivers, so I don't think most people will be needing these extra magnets too often. Lastly, there is a trigger return stiffness spring. Set the spring tension to ensure you have a nice and clean rebound of your trigger after pulling. In essence, this is also repeating the same sort of effect that your trigger spring does, but this setting will help reset the Clicker V2 and trigger at the same time. Since the Clicker V2 has a trigger return spring, the actual use of your stock trigger spring may be optional depending on your tuning and trigger setting. Once you've tuned all the adjustment screws how you'd like, you can go ahead and reinstall your HPA Engine, Perun HPA trigger board, and selector plate. Next, we can move on to final testing and calibration. If you have a calibration error in your selector, such as I did, in my case both semi and full auto fired in a full auto fire mode, then you actually have to initiate selector position recalibration. Recalibration was likely required here because I didn't set my Perun HPA trigger board back in the exact same position of how it was when I removed it. This is because the board's held in by a single screw and free floats a little bit around that screw, so if you don't have it in the exact position, the selector plate may not be picked up the same every time you install it. To be able to retune the selector plate, you have to be able to pull the trigger in safe mode. So if you opted not to install the trigger stop, then you're probably laughing now. But in my case, I had to wiggle my gearbox out and back the screw off for the trigger stop so that I can get the trigger pulled in safe and the selector sensor recalibrated. To calibrate the selector plate, just follow the Perun manual for the V2 HPA trigger board. Plug in a battery and immediately hold the trigger down in safe mode to enter sensor check mode. Keep the gun in safe and pull the trigger and hold again to enter selector calibration mode. With the selector still in safe mode, pull the trigger once and you'll hear a beep. Move the selector to semi, pull the trigger once and you'll hear a beep. Move the selector to auto, pull the trigger once and you'll hear a beep. Move the selector back to semi, pull the trigger once and then you'll hear 3 beeps indicating a successful recalibration. Once these steps are completed, you're actually still left in selector calibration mode so that you can flip through your selector positions and observe the LED color coming out of the gearbox. You might need to turn the light off to see the LED color if you've installed everything just like I have. The LED will appear blue for semi, red for full auto, and white for safe mode positions if everything's calibrated correctly. Just be mindful every time you install your trigger board, you may need to recalibrate the selector sensor just like we did here due to a slight misalignment in how you screw it in each time. I always like to test fire with air plugged in, just to ensure everything's working smoothly. When I first heard about the clicker by Perun, I admit that I was a little skeptical and wasn't even really sure what it could do for me. But after installing one and using it for a bit, I can say it definitely enhances the trigger feel and tunability of your rifle. Just be prepared with a 6-pound trigger pull, you might have a sore hand after playing a full day of airsoft. Hopefully you found this video helpful on what the Clicker V2 Pro is and how it can be tuned to your liking.